Hello, welcome back to Scriptural Analysis, the Law of the Covenant. This is video 3, part 4, the Abrahamic Covenant. The purpose of this video is to identify the structure of God's governance model surrounding the covenant God made with Abraham. So grab your popcorn, because this video is a little longer, but you are in for a treat. So what is so special about the covenant God gave to Abraham? Why is it important to you? What difference does it make whether you live the terms of the covenant or choose to live outside of those terms? Well, to understand those questions, one has to recognize a pattern the authors have included within their writings. This pattern provides education to the reader on two distinct timelines. The purpose of this video is to show how these timelines are included in the writings of the authors. The first timeline occurs during the life of the author and can be defined as the author's classical writings. The second timeline references through to the end of the world, which end is defined by the corrupt systems of this world being overthrown during the second coming of the Son of God, who will usher in a new system during a new time that the authors define as occurring within the 7th millennium of humanity, of which, according to their timeline, we are now in. These second timeline passages can be defined as the author's apocalyptical writings. These two timelines identify to the reader the governance model that God has structured to allow His children the best chance for happiness while living on this earth, outside of His presence, but still inclusive of Him and His offerings to them. How, you ask? Or should have asked? Well, the first timeline, during the life of the author, provides education for how abiding God's covenant in its entirety worked for a group of people living in a small geographical area, which area was defined in the Old Testament. In that geographical area was found the blood lineage or descendants of Abraham. And because these descendants were also the recipients of the covenant made with Abraham, the reader is educated on the different circumstances that occurred to people who honored the covenant. They received blessings or divine protection, as opposed to the people who would have no part of the covenant, receiving cursings and non-protection. In essence, God is teaching the reader through these examples. And what is it that He is teaching? Well, He is showing that what God has done in the past in relation to both categories or types of people, He will do in the future, in a manner that parallels the past. So on a micro level, that being an individual level, the lesson being taught is that during every lifetime cycle, from beginning of humanity to end, the promise of P cubed, a promised land, an enduring posterity, and divine protection is always available to those willing to live God's defined terms. And that will provide both individual and group security and prosperity. The author's patterned second timeline, referencing through to the end of the world's corrupt systems, provide the reader an extended metaphor, an allegory, if you will, which teaches God's plan for extending this covenant. And for us living in this 7th millennium, we are able to look back through time and witness this dynamic governing structure unfold and envelope the purposes of God's plan, according to the statements of prophecy included by the authors. By first teaching the reader on a micro level how God interacts with mankind through the Abrahamic covenant, the authors are laying the foundation for greater things to come. The prophesied future return of the Son of God is that greater thing they refer to, and the events that will exist at that time will require the promises provided by the Abrahamic covenant be found across the entire globe, as that culminating event will affect the whole earth. Think about that for a moment. The author's classical writings about their day and the importance of the Abrahamic covenant to the people involved a localized area where it was very easy to discern the difference between those that received the promises and those that did not, especially divine protection. Then, the author's apocalyptical writings about the end of the earth, using their present-day happenings as a metaphor to inform the future covenant holders and seekers what will transpire leading up to and during end times, and how important and necessary P cubed will be for them, not just locally, but over the entire globe. So now we see God's governance strategy. From a single man, God would protect this bloodline due to the covenant promise to Abraham, and rely on the passing of earthly centuries to allow this lineage to be assimilated to every continent, so it could be found around the circumference of the world, and God's promised freedoms, secure families, and divine protection would be available to all nations accepting the covenant, leading up to the future chaos that will take place to change earthly governance from human to divine. And paralleling the author's day, there will also be a great distinction in our day between the nations that allow the covenant to be present in their lands versus those that do not. And this will be discussed in later videos. Let's briefly examine God's governance in bringing this global circumstance to fruition. And remember, the purpose of these videos is to keep it simple, so the following will deliberately bypass some intriguing information. For now, after the flood and a chance for the new beginning to take hold, God chose one man named Abraham to receive his covenant promise. Abraham has 2 sons while his wife Sarah lived, Ishmael, with the handmaiden Hagar under Sarah's blessing to produce an heir, and over a decade later, Isaac, Sarah's firstborn. Isaac, born of Abraham's wife Sarah, receives the birthright blessing of the covenant promise. Isaac has Esau and Jacob as sons. Jacob receives the birthright blessing of the covenant promise. Jacob, who later becomes identified by the name Israel, has 12 sons. One of his sons, Joseph, suffers an amazing life, being removed from Jacob and his family for a long time, but in his absence becomes second in command only to Pharaoh of Egypt in governance, and miraculously finds himself in a position to save Jacob, or Israel's, family, which are Abraham's descendants, from a famine that engulfs the land due to covenant cursings. This history of the life of Joseph is an amazing allegory of the adventure awaiting for this bloodline and global roles of future earthly covenant governance. Earthly covenant governance is not to be confused with earthly political governance, as these are completely unrelated, and will be discussed in other videos. For now, we see that through Joseph, God did fulfill his promise to Abraham by applying P cubed to his descendants, saving them from a certain death by famine. And keep in mind that even though this written record references men, they all had wives and children, and as families they were protected, and as families they honored God. So a woman should never feel left out by these histories, as women are always an equal partner with God in the terms of his covenant. And if we knew the whole truth of these men, we would probably realize that without the women that were in their lives, they would never have reached the levels in God's plan that they did. Joseph, having the birthright blessing of the covenant promise, provides for his two sons Manasseh and Ephraim to stand in with Jacob, or Israel's 12 sons, to lead the posterity, because both him and Levi would remain outside of that distinction for reasons not discussed in this video. These 12 men developed into 12 tribes encompassing one nation over the timeline of hundreds of years, including 400 years captivity to the Egyptians, which became the end result of having come to live near Joseph during his days as a ruler there and over-relying on the Egyptians for social welfare. These 12 tribes eventually leave Egypt as Moses becomes God's servant to apply the covenant blessings of P cubed to Abraham's lineage before they are destroyed. They then take over the lands in and around Jerusalem and live there for centuries. However, the day comes when those lands are conquered and taken from them by a warring nation from the north, as those people ignored the terms of the covenant and lost the ability for the covenant blessings of P cubed, especially divine protection. So where they were once a covenant people, these people foolishly thought they could change the terms of the divine to human covenant, and instead of covenant blessings, received the covenant cursings, and through subsequent wars were chaotically scattered all across the globe, eventually settling in on the various continents. Now let's briefly jump ahead on this timeline for a moment and combine the actual lineage of Abraham being scattered across the globe with the command of the resurrected Jesus to his apostle Peter to go and teach the law of the covenant to all people, meaning Gentiles as well, as opposed to just the lineage of Abraham. And God has now fulfilled his purpose to ensure the covenant blessings can be administered throughout the world and fulfill the promise he made with Abraham in protecting his lineage, so the events of the 7th millennium can commence, as now the divine protection can provide a remnant of people, those who will find and live God's law of the covenant, the ability to carry on after the author's prophesied destruction that is to attend the second coming of the Son of God. Such is God's governance plan. God could have given this covenant to many people after the flood. Wouldn't it be easier to give it to someone on each continent? Sure it would have. But then imagine all the confusion that would have occurred regarding who was authorized and who was not. And imagine the potential for change within the various covenants. No, God, who is the master teacher, chose one man in one family, and from that choice, one lesson was allowed to be taught over and over again for thousands of years. That lesson? Honor the law of the covenant and receive both temporal and eternal protection for you and your family. And yet, even with that one beginning and one constant message, observe the confusion 4,000 years later. It is simply astonishing. But this confusion can educate us on the difference between religion, which is man-made, and the law of the covenant, which is God-given. I hope you found that fascinating. And what is also fascinating, is just how did Abraham become that one man? For that, you will have to watch my next video, where I examine the personal life of Abraham and how it relates to you, regardless of whether you are female or male. Thanks for tuning in. I look forward to you joining me for Video 3, Part 5, where I continue with the teachings from the writings about what we can learn from the author's history of the life of Abraham and how it applies to us in God's governance structure. Until next time, take care and contemplate these things.